Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Every Movie Ever. I am Eric and this is of course the show where we are trying to review every movie ever made. And today we are in the local public library to talk to you about movies that are based on true stories. And what better place to do that than the library? I mean, take a look. It's in a book. Feel free, and obviously this is the place to find true stories, but the movies are too. And we're going to start today with a movie called Loving. Loving is a terrific movie. It was up for a couple of Oscars just this past year. It's really, truly terrific. This is a movie about the Supreme Court case that eliminated laws against interracial marriage. Obviously, it's a very touching, true story. And what I like a lot about this movie is it ignores the obvious route of doing it as a court drama and spending a lot of time on the legalities and stuff, and it really makes a very small and intimate movie about the two people, the somewhat ironically named Loving family, who are at the center of the case. It was directed by Jeff Nichols, who directed the terrific movies Mud and Midnight Special, but this is something of an altogether different magnitude. This is a really tender and terrific and quiet movie in a way that's just so effective and moving that I think you really have to see it. Ruth Negga shines as Mrs. Loving. And yeah, I can't say enough good things about it. It was a really terrific movie, 4 stars. Jumping back to the Oscar side of the fence, let's look at The Big Short. This was directed by Adam McKay, which is unusual. You see, The Big Short is a movie that's all about the housing bubble and the financial collapse that followed it. It stars some big-name Oscar baity kind of people like Christian Bale and Ryan Gosling and Brad Pitt, along with Steve Carell. But like I said, it was directed by Adam McKay, who is best known for directing like Anchorman or Talladega Nights or Step Brothers. But here he uses some of those comedy and improv chops to turn in a really compelling movie about that, sad and ultimately avoidable moment in American history, and focusing on the people who saw, the very few people who saw the bubble coming, who saw the collapse coming, and who weren't listened to. It is a movie that tries to teach a lot, and because of that, it could have been a very boring movie. But those teaching moments McKay does in such a compelling way, both through his compelling main characters and through some really entertaining segments like having Margot Robbie just as herself show up on screen to explain part of what's going on. Because if you're like me, I mean, you know about the housing bubble and you know about the financial crisis, but you're a little bit fuzzy on the details. And this movie, in a super entertaining way, clears a lot of that up and is also very interesting and compelling to watch. This was a great movie. It sounds like he's going to stay in this sort of dramatic mode, Adam McKay is, for a little while. And I'm excited to see what he does next. But as for The Big Short itself, I'm going to give that 4 stars. Let's move then from The Big Short to The Big Sick. The Big Sick, which I'll come right out and say it, may well be the best movie I've seen this year. This is a movie that was written by a couple of comedians whose work I've been following for a while now, Kumail Nanjiani and his wife Emily Gordon. Kumail, you probably know from Silicon Valley or from The Meltdown with Jonah and Kumail. He's a Pakistani gentleman who's come to America and been living here for a while and become a great stand-up comedian. This is a story that he and his wife wrote about how they met and fell in love, and how while they were courting, she went into a medically induced coma for a week, and how Kumail spent that time with her parents, and how big of a moment that was in that relationship, and how it solidified things, particularly for Kumail. Obviously, Emily is in a coma for most of the movie, so the movie centers more on Kumail, and particularly on him and dealing with his family, his Pakistani family, and their culture, who are still very dedicated to arranged marriage, which is a thing that he doesn't want to be a part of. This is a really terrific and amazing movie, a very small movie. Kumail and Emily wrote something great here. Kumail stars as himself. Emily is played by an actress named Zoe Kazan, and in addition to that, playing Emily's parents, you have Ray Romano and Holly Hunter, who are both turning in really, really amazing performances. There's a lot of really small human detail in this movie that is never boring or cliche and never feels like one of those self-important indie movies. This is a love story that is really and truly compelling and human and something a little different. It was directed by Michael Showalter, who you might remember from The State, and he's directed a couple of movies that, you know, I thought were all right. You know, this was his moment here. This was a great movie. Where this is going to fare come award season this year is hard to say. Obviously, it is not the showy kind of movie the Oscars love. It doesn't have the big names they love. It seems entirely possible that this could get a nomination and even a win for Best Original Screenplay, and I really hope it does. They certainly deserve it. Terrific movie. If you have Amazon Prime, I believe it is streaming now on Amazon Prime because it was something that Amazon released. Please, please see it. 5 big stars. Let's talk about Mississippi Burning. This is a movie that when I see it come up in on Netflix or on cable as an on-demand movie, I'm always like, I should watch that. It stars Gene Hackman and Willem Dafoe as a couple of FBI agents in the South in the 50s or the 60s who are dealing with racial problems in the South. They're dealing with, you know, with the Klan and with young black men being murdered. It is a movie that, you know, has important things to say and shines a light on some things that are important to know about if you don't know about them already, and even if you do. The problem with the movie is that this is at least the second time I've seen it. And I sat down to watch it thinking I had never seen it before. About 10 minutes in, I was like, I think I've seen this movie. And here's the thing. This may be the third time I've seen this. I feel like this has happened before. And that's a problem with the movie, that it's sort of unmemorable. That when I go to watch it, it's not like, oh, I'm going to watch this again. It's, oh, I think I saw this. Isn't this what happens? So it's a good movie, but it's sort of forgettable in a way that isn't great for it, which is why I'm only going to give it 3 stars. Our next true story is The Founder, another movie that came out this year. This one starring Michael Keaton playing Ray Kroc, the founder of McDonald's. If you know anything about this story, you know what this movie is about, which is that a couple of guys in California, played in this movie by Nick Offerman and that big guy who used to play Drew Carey's brother on The Drew Carey Show. Sorry, I can't remember his name. They're 2 brothers who start a fast food restaurant in California called McDonald's. It's all about efficiency, and they design this whole, you know, this whole sort of way of putting together the burgers in a very quick and revolutionary way. And then this guy, Roy Kroc, comes in and sort of tries to franchise it and ends up pushing the brothers out and not paying them anything. It's a really weird and sad story, and everybody's great in it. It's fascinating to see the origins of McDonald's and how different those origins are from what it is today. And, you know, it's a heartbreaking American story. You know, we tend to think of the American story and the American dream as being about, you know, if you work hard enough, you can achieve anything. And here's a story about these 2 brothers who did that, and then a sort of con man who came in and took it all away from them. Keaton, who's always has done good work, has been doing some tremendous work lately. This is another great, you know, performance from him, where every time you see him on the screen, you can almost literally see the wheels turning in his head, which is a fascinating, you know, style of performance. The Founder was directed by John Lee Hancock. He'd previously directed The Blind Side and Saving Mr. Banks, both of which I thought were kind of ho-hum movies. But he does a great job here with the period setting and everything, and in recreating that McDonald's and in working with tremendous actors. I thought this was a real solid movie, 3.5 stars. Now, if you know anything about me, and if you look at the t-shirts I'm often wearing, including today, you know I am a comic book fan, and my all-time favorite comic is the Fantastic Four. And I would love to see a great Fantastic Four movie, and arguably there was one. It's called The Incredibles, and Pixar made it. But you know, as far as actual Fantastic Four movies, there was that one that came out just a couple of years ago, and it is terrible. And then there are those two that came out in the early 2000s with like Jessica Alba in them, and they are pretty bad. And then there's one you might never have heard of that came, well, it didn't come out in the 90s, and that's the problem. It was a Fantastic Four movie produced by Roger Corman, and it was never officially released, but if you go to a comic convention or probably even check YouTube now, you can find bootlegs of it, and it is pretty bad. Although I think more charming than the official adaptation. Still, largely for budgetary reasons, is not very good. Now, it's a fascinating story about how this movie didn't come out, and it's the subject of a documentary that came out recently called Doomed. So and I'm reviewing Doomed in case I went too far down the FF rabbit hole there. This is a pretty good documentary that manages to talk to a lot of the cast and the crew, including Corman himself, about what was going on with this movie. And it's sort of a long and detailed story that the gist of it is that the studio that had the rights to make a Fantastic Four movie needed to make a quick one just to be able to retain those rights. The rights to make an FF movie were going to expire for them unless they released, you know, made a movie by a certain point. And so they threw a very small budget at Roger Corman, the acclaimed, I don't know about claimed, but the B-movie maven Roger Corman. If you don't know who Corman is, he made so many movies. He's still making movies today, but he made the original Little Shop of Horrors, Dementia 13. He started the careers of Death Race 2000. He started the careers of guys like Jack Nicholson, the directing career of Ron Howard. Like Roger, and he's legendarily the only producer in Hollywood to have never lost money. He knows exactly how much money to put into a movie, and he knows exactly what the formula is of how much violence and explosions and nudity there needs to be in a movie for it to be successful. And I don't want to call him cynical. There's a lot of interviews of him in this movie, and his interviews are always interesting to look at. Doomed, it's a good story. It suffers a little bit from being kind of a talking head documentary, but they did find a lot of behind the scenes stills and stuff to illustrate what's going on. It's certainly worth seeing. 3 stars. Now, outside of comics, obviously another thing I love is movies, and I like documentaries about the makings of movies and things like that. So I really gravitated to Electric Boogaloo, which is a movie about the infamous Cannon Studios. Now, I've reviewed a number of Cannon movies on this show, and I will continue to review Cannon movies because I kind of love them. And this is, like I say, a documentary about that studio, about its rise and its fall. And it's 2 producers, Golan and Globus, a couple of guys from Israel who came to America wanting to make movies and wanting to make, it seems like they thought they could make great movies. It seems like they thought they could make huge blockbusters and Oscar-winning pictures, but that they could do so by spending very little money and by being very exploitive with their movies. And sometimes that formula it resulted in just amazing movies. Not amazingly good, but a lot of them being in that sort of, these are so nuts, so bad that they are amazing to watch. Electric Boogaloo, as a documentary, is fascinating to watch. It's interesting to learn a lot about Golan and Globus and who they were and what their goals were. And they spend a lot of time, looking at individual movies and talking about some of the more bizarre movies that Cannon made, like The Apple, and spending a lot of time talking about their relationship with stars, particularly the 2 Chucks, Charles Bronson and Chuck Norris, who starred in a lot of their movies. This is a really interesting one, and a documentary I've watched a couple of times because it is, interesting and compelling to watch. Again, it suffers a little bit from being a little bit talking heady and from not having so much behind the scenes stuff to turn to as far as footage. So it, has a lot of clips of movies, but then I like movie clips and I like to see the clips of these nuts movies. So all in all, I'm going to give it 3.5 stars. The King of Kong is one of my favorite documentaries. This is a movie about 2 guys, 2 real guys, Billy Mitchell and Steve Wiebe, Steve Wiebe is a guy who wants to get the high score on Donkey Kong, and Billy Mitchell is the guy who has the high score on Donkey Kong. And you would think there wouldn't really be anything more to it, but you end up going into this really bizarre world of competitive video gaming and the culture that's grown up around it. And, you know, all of this weird, you know, kind of backstabbing and secret maneuvering that Billy Mitchell does, and everything that Steve as the underdog tries to do to be recognized and for having a high score at a video game. And all this sort of clandestine stuff. It's super weird and super entertaining, and it does the thing that I love the most in a documentary, where it takes you into a subculture that you've never seen before and lays the whole thing open, warts and all. Really terrific movie. 4 stars. Let's look at another great biopic, this time with The Miracle Worker. This is sort of a two-pronged biopic, although biopic might be pushing it. Biopic, I think, implies a longer look at a person's life, and this is a look at just, I don't know, a couple of months in the lives of 2 great women, being Helen Keller and her tutor. Played by Patty Duke as Helen Keller. Anne Bancroft is the tutor whose name, I'm sorry, is escaping me right now. I should be able to remember it. But in any event, this is the story of how she got through to Helen. Helen, of course, the young woman born at the turn of the century who could not speak or hear or see, and of her tutor who figured out a way to get through to her and teach her language. It is a beautiful and beautifully told and acted story that again presents characters as sort of being warts and all. We really get to see Anne Bancroft play insecurities and, you know, struggle with her life. And Patty Duke plays Helen not just as a prop, but as a soulful character, all in her own right. A really beautiful movie, 4.5 stars. A movie in a similar vein, that being a biopic that sort of focuses on a short amount of time, that's Lincoln. Steven Spielberg's portrait of Lincoln is played by Daniel Day-Lewis from a couple of years back, toward the end of the Civil War as he fights for the Emancipation Proclamation. Daniel Day-Lewis, you know, a lot has been said about him as an actor, especially in this day and age, and about his method techniques of getting into character and stuff. Lincoln is certainly a good movie. It's certainly extremely well executed and looks great, and Daniel Day-Lewis is tremendous as Lincoln, and Sally Field, who I don't think gets a lot of credit, is great as Mary Todd. It's a good movie, but one that I kind of feel a little shruggy about. Like, it's a good movie, but it's not one that I'm like, oh, I loved that movie, or I can't wait to revisit it. It's like, yeah, Lincoln's a pretty good movie. And, you know, as such, I just don't have a ton to say about it outside of to give it 3.5 stars. Speaking of Spielberg, he was the subject of his own sort of biopic, this time a documentary called Spielberg, from director Susan Lacey that premiered recently on HBO. This really does tell the whole story, really gets into his entire filmography and, you know, his life, you know, his family life and where he came from. And sort of and that's in a way the problem with it, is the movie almost tries to tackle too much and ends up feeling more like a very comprehensive but no less introductory look at the man and his work. Because it tackles so much, there's not a lot of time spent really taking a deep dive into any one thing. And so we really get sort of a surface look at him and his family and at the themes he tackles in his movies. I would like to see something more in depth, you know, even if it just focuses on a couple of movies or a particular aspect of his career. But that said, it's still no less entertaining. Again, you get to see a lot of good movie clips and you get to hear some interesting stuff, but it's sort of just, you know, it's kind of not enough. It's a strong appetizer, and for that I'm giving it 3 stars. Now, another one of my personal favorite documentaries of all time has got to be F for Fake. This is one of, I believe, the last movie that Orson Welles completed as a director. It's a movie that sort of started out, it was supposed to be a documentary about this guy whose name I believe is Elmire, who was an art forger. But as Welles is doing this documentary about the art forger, there's another guy there who's writing an article about the art forger. And as Welles is continuing to make the movie, that guy writes a book wherein about Howard Hughes, where he had these clandestine interviews with Howard Hughes and wrote a whole book about it. And then it comes out that none of that ever happened, that those were a fake. And so Wells finds himself in the middle of this sprawling documentary about fakers and all this stuff that's going on around him. And he makes it sort of a decentralized documentary that looks at all of this stuff around him that's fake and looks at artifice, you know, in filmmaking and in life, and especially in art. And it's a really fascinating and interesting movie that is unfocused in a way that is actually, I think, to its benefit, that allows Wells to hop around and do interesting things with movie making and editing to tell this story of trickery, which is a thing that, if you know anything about him, is very close to his heart. This is a really fascinating movie that if you haven't seen it, I think you should. I've shown it to classes here at the station before, and typically when we finish it, they're like, oh, I did not like that, that was boring. But then a couple days later, they're still talking about it. There's still, you know, there's something about it that's so intrinsically fascinating and inescapable that even if your initial reaction to it is sort of so-so, it sort of plants a seed in your brain. It's a movie that I like a lot, and that's why I'm going to give it 4 stars. Let's take a look at another movie documentary, this time with Never Sleep Again. Now, you know, when you sit down to watch a documentary, you're thinking, oh, what's this going to be, an hour and 20 minutes, hour 40 minutes? This sucker's like 3.5 hours, and it is an in-depth look at the making of the Nightmare on Elm Street series. It is a documentary that does the tremendous job of making you both love and hate these movies, because there is a lot of things that's gross about them. But at the same time, like, to see something that goes so in-depth about the making of each of them and really takes the time to explain and understand things, that you can't help but love it at the same time. This is in a lot of ways the movie that I wish Spielberg was, where, yeah, it goes in depth into all, you know, what, 7 or 8 of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, but it benefits from there only being 7 or 8 of them, as opposed to, what, the 20-something movies Spielberg has made. It interviews a lot of cast members, takes us behind the scenes of a lot of stuff, a lot of behind the scenes crew members as well. It's really fascinating and interesting. Its only downfall is that it's ultimately about the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, which ultimately, no matter how hard the movie tries, you are either going to be a huge fan of or so on or whatever. Still, it's something interesting to watch if you've got the time. 3.5 stars. So let's finish off tonight with The Late Shift, which is a true story movie, another HBO movie that I find myself coming back to a lot for some reason. It's a movie that's all about the late night wars when Johnny Carson retired and Letterman and Leno were both vying for The Tonight Show, and all of the weird clandestine behind the scenes stuff and power stuff that was going on there. It's based on a book by Bill Carter, who was a fellow alumni of mine and who I've met a couple of times, and a really nice guy. He also wrote the screenplay for it, so, you know, that definitely affects my enjoyment of it, is I met the guy and like him. But it's also sort of weird in, you know, a lot of times the HBO movies, like in Recount, they don't cast anybody to play Bush or Gore. They just kind of avoid them a little bit and focus on the other characters around them. This is a movie that casts a David Letterman and a Jay Leno and puts weird makeup on people and really forces them into doing impersonations, so much so that Rich Little, the legendary impressionist, plays Johnny Carson in the movie, which is super weird. So this movie is really odd, but the story is so compelling in a lot of ways, it's hard to reconcile. It's a movie that I do find myself rewatching every couple of years, and it's right there in the middle of being bad and good in a way that I've got to give it 3 stars. Well, that's it for our look at true story movies. We'll be back next time when we keep trying to watch every movie ever.